the money. And this morning it leads to how some of the world's rich and powerful are hiding their wealth. As we have been reporting this morning here on CBC News Network, the largest ever document leak is giving us an unprecedented look inside offshore tax havens. You know Frédéric Zalac, he's part of the CBC News team, been combing through the millions of documents, 11.5 million altogether. I guess you haven't seen every page yet, but most of them. Frédéric, thank you for coming in today. We've certainly watched your investigative work into this area. So here we are with the Panama Papers today. Because if you're just joining us on this, this has been a cache of documents that were disclosed. Let's get some of the context to help us understand what we're dealing with first.
Yes, so it was basically we've been doing stories on offshore tax havens with the International Consortium of Investigative Journalists for several years. And part of that team, there's a newspaper in Germany, the Süddeutsche Zeitung, and they started receiving information from a source that contacted him through encrypted communication and wanted to release this information. And so this became one of, it is the largest leak ever of confidential information like that. It's just to give you an idea of the size, it's 1,000 times bigger than what WikiLeaks was at the time.
That's extraordinary. And why do we call it the Panama Papers?
Because it's coming from a law firm based in Panama. So in Panama City, it's called Mossack Fonseca. They are one of the largest providers of offshore shell companies in the world. They'll provide you also with nominee directors or even nominee shareholders where people could actually, their name will not appear in any papers. They could be behind this wall of secrecy.
Okay, so shell companies, they know. They've been involved in that. So this leak comes forward, 11.5 million documents. And what stands out chiefly for you, Frédéric?
Well, I guess two things. One is obviously the fact that it's a very recent leak. So we're not dealing with old data from 10 years ago. We're seeing a cross-section from 1977 until December of 2015.
I mean, that's the extra 40 years worth of documentation.
And it goes until just a few months ago.
Okay.
And this is extraordinary because it was almost like a live leak. As we were working on it, new information was coming in, new emails that were even more recent. So that is something where we have the snapshot of what's going on in tax havens today. And even with all the efforts to crack down on tax havens, we can see that there's still things going on there. We can see that now. Also, the other element, I guess, would be the heads of states. That we haven't seen, that many politicians. And there's, for example, the Prime Minister of Iceland, who is a sitting prime minister right now. So
there are 12 current and former heads of state or heads of government or their family members or their associates and 140 other politicians or public figures. I mean, as you said, that's an extraordinary number.
From around the world. And those are the names that we could find, because often you don't even have the name of the ultimate beneficial owner. This is because it was written in an email, there's a passport somewhere, but you don't always get that in this leak. And that's one thing that people have to understand, is that it doesn't just, because you have a leak, you've got everything there. It's just clues, tantalizing clues that you have to follow and do all the legwork after that to really make sure that you have the complete picture about each person.
Okay, so Iceland, Poroshenko from Ukraine, Putin in Russia, David Cameron in the UK, his father. We should probably state, there's nothing illegal in and of itself, is there, to set up an offshore account?
Exactly.
So what's wrong with that, the fact that those political figures have these?
I think it's a question of transparency, especially when you're in a position of power like that. For example, in the case of the Prime Minister of Iceland, he reacted today by saying, you know what, I declared everything to the tax authorities on this. But it goes further than that, because when you look at his case particularly, he basically had a shell company that had bonds of the big banks that went under in Iceland. And there were negotiations for to see how much would be given back to creditors. He was, in a way, a creditor of those banks, but it was not known. So while he was doing those negotiations, did that affect his decisions as a prime minister. And that raises a lot of questions. It's not just a question of declare it to the taxman or not. There's all these questions, especially for people in position of power.
Okay, so as far as reaction, there have been calls for impeachment proceedings for Poroshenko. There have been calls for, Putin said, it's just essentially just another attempt to target and besmirch his reputation. David Cameron has said his father's affairs, his late father's affairs, they shall remain private. But the reaction has been very strong, very quickly. Where do you think this might go?
I think this, especially for the leaders that are already stuck with this, is going to be a big problem. There's an emergency meeting for the Icelandic parliament, so there could be an election in Iceland because of this fairly soon. So there are going to be a lot of questions asked around the world to every politician, not just the ones that are in the leak now. We are starting to see that, where they're being asked, do you have offshore accounts?
Interesting.
Yeah.
And as far as Canada, John Northcott, we've been reporting that there are hundreds of Canadian passport names involved, but you were telling me leading into our conversation on there, those aren't really significant. One of the things that is, though, is a Canadian bank. That's RBC, and we're going to put up their statement on the screen because they've already responded to this being included as part of this Panama Papers leak. RBC, how does this fall in the Canadian connection? What should we pay attention to there, Frédéric?
I think it's interesting to see that one of our major financial institutions has been using this firm in Panama. So it may be all legal, and that's what basically they're saying.
Yes.
But there's a lot of questions raised about using those shell companies and what's the reason behind. Is there someone that wants to be hidden? And in their statement, what RBC is saying is basically we have good due diligence procedures. We know who we're dealing with, so don't worry. But from what, we haven't really looked at all the details linked to the companies linked to RBC yet. But we know that for other institutions, for example, UBS and HSBC, which were also the target of big leaks in the past and big scandals came from that, that there were a lot of problems when you start digging into it. It may all be fine with RBC. We don't know to this point, but all we can say is there were more than 370, maybe 378 companies that were created for their clients.
Obviously, there is more to come emanating from these Panama Papers over the days and weeks to come. Political repercussions, we will wait to see, but Frédéric has done incredible investigative work to date, and we'll look forward to this. And just telling me on the Fifth Estate this Friday night, we'll talk more about that, but you're putting together a piece on this for Friday night, so we will see that. CBC Television, 9 p.m. and 9:30 in Newfoundland to look ahead. Frédéric Zalac, I thank you very much for being here this morning.